welcome to the webinar we have today. And let me bring up the slide, sorry. All right, welcome everyone. The topic today is Big Power Responsibility, how US and China can collaborate on climate change. My name is Min Fan. I'm Executive Director of the US Heartland China Association. This event is made possible through close collaboration among Natural Resources Defense Council, University of Denver, Joseph Corbell School International Studies, the Center for China-US Cooperation, and the US Heartland China Association. And just two housekeeping items before we start. Please enter your questions through the Q&A option. We did receive a lot of questions beforehand, and our speakers will address them throughout the session. Finally, at the end, please take a brief moment to let us know what you think. A short survey will pop up. And now let me turn to Bob Holden, Chairman CEO of US Heartland China Association, former Governor Missouri, to give very brief opening remarks. Governor Holden?
Thanks, man, and delighted to have all of you on the screen today. And this is a tremendous issue that needs to be discussed and hopefully come to some conclusions after we get past the November elections. There's probably climate change is probably no more important issue in the world, and the fact of China and the United States, if we can figure out how to work together, can be real problem solvers. And that's what this is all about. Our Way Forward series is always about looking ahead, how we can improve, how we can make things better. And we couldn't have a better group of panelists today, and Sam is our leader in moving this discussion forward. And I'm delighted to have everybody participating. Good luck and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great, thank you, Governor Holden. Now I turn to Sam. And Sam, I'm going to turn the podium to you to lead us through the session.
And first of all, I want to take this opportunity to thank Governor Bob Holden, for his leadership on the heartland areas relationship with China. In fact, he has made a lot of efforts, organized a lot of programs to link this part of the US with China. This is particularly important in a time when the communications between the two governments in Beijing and Washington have not been so well, and people to people and non-government communications in this case will play a particularly important role. And also, I think I want to thank Min Fan, the executive director of the Heartland Association for China. And she has done so much and done so well on the program here. And the issue today we are going to discuss is the big power responsibility, how these two big economies in the world, China and the US, could collaborate on this very important issue of climate change. As Bob mentioned, that we have assembled a very excellent panel of experts in this country on the issues in both sides of the Pacific. We will start with Dr. Barbara Finnemer. She is the Senior Strategic Director for Asia at the Natural Resource Defense Council. And she has worked on environmental law and energy policy for 4 decades with a focus on China for 30 years. She has a new book. When I say new, was published last year, Will China Save the Planet? In fact, we had honored that to have her to have a book talk last year in our university, and which was a very successful, and a lot of people in our community really loved that book. They bought the book and sold out of all the books we presented. And she also worked for the US Department of Justice and Interior, the UNDP, and the Center for International Environmental Law. And she will present first on the her research on the China side. Then we have our own dean, Dr. Fritz Meyer. She came at Joseph Colbert School of International Studies. She came from Duke to Denver 1.5 years ago, have changed the school entirely. A lot of new initiatives have been launched. One of the initiatives I want to mention here is a MA degree and research program on global environmental sustainability, which I think is very important for the school to raise its profile in the frontier or cutting edge researchers in the academic world. And although she is a dean, she has been doing research and teaching on the teaching class, and also doing research on the issues of globalization and its impacts on the global and environmental issues. He will talk from American perspective. Then we have Beth Kirk. Dr. Beth Kirk has a joint appointment at Schwarzman College in Tsinghua University, which I think is a very top, very unique program in China, endowed by American entrepreneur for $60 billion. I heard that was the program to start. And she has been teaching there, but based in the US, she's also assistant in practice at our competing school SAIS in Washington, DC. According to her bio, I like that. She was a Rotary Scholar to Hong Kong about 40 years ago. And she went to China 40 years ago then. Since then, she has been caught by China back. That's what she wrote. And have worked on China for 40 years. And she was based in Beijing, working for US Federal Aviation Administration and Boeing Company, and also for the Kmart in the US. She would talk from the business perspective on a climate change issue. So, as I said, we have a very excellent panel. We'll start our presentation. The way we do it is that we give each panelist about 10, 12 minutes to make their points. That then we'll open the floor to the questions. We received so many questions, so I think we try to give ample time for the Q&A part. To start, we have Barbara, Dr. Finamo. Here, I think she will talk about China's development on this side. To start, I want to make a little bit remark on this, because a lot of people has been surprised by the Chinese President Xi Jinping in September last month in the UN Assembly to pledge by 2065, China will be carbon neutral. It's a really surprise from nowhere. And although the environmentalist community welcomes this pledge, but there are so many problems there. In fact, I still remember some years ago, 2000, I think 9 in the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit, and China has pushed the developed countries to commit more carbon emission. And said China and developing countries should not commit that much. And then China finally joined the Paris Climate Accord, 2015. And since then, China has committed by 2030 to peak their emission. Now, certainly they said carbon neutral, but without giving any details there. I read this document, the speech, without any details. So there are many questions here from our audience. I think that's also my question here. What is viability of China's pledge? And from your research, how do you see this whole issue there?
Thank you, Sam. Let's see if I can share my screen so I can give you a quick background on China's carbon neutral pledge. Just one moment.
Coming up. Yes.
Great.
All right. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you to the U.S. Heartland China Institute and to the University of Denver Corbel Institute for having me here today. It's my pleasure to be with my fellow panelists and with all of you who have joined us. Now, how do I advance the screen? Oh dear. Oops. There can be no dispute that climate change is happening, and it's happening now. In the U.S., it has enabled record-setting fires in Colorado, and it exacerbated in extreme weather events like the derecho that destroyed over 10 million acres of prime cropland throughout the Midwest. Perhaps some of you are still dealing with the impacts of that as we speak. In China as well, torrential rains and historic levels of flooding have affected over 24 million people just since July, in the last 3 months. And after 3 typhoons in 2 weeks in China's agricultural heartland, one of the major provinces in China has lost up to 70% of its corn. In the Paris Agreement, it calls upon every party to peak its CO2 emissions as soon as possible and to reach climate neutrality or net zero emissions in the second half of this century. It also calls upon parties to take stock of where they are in 2020 and to strengthen their climate pledges. Now, China's initial pledge in Paris was to peak its CO2 emissions around 2030. But there was no indication of what level of emissions that peak would involve and what would happen afterwards. So that left many people concerned that after 2030, China would continue to plateau its CO2 emissions at a very high level indefinitely. Yet last month at the first virtual UN General Assembly, as Sam said, Xi Jinping suddenly announced that China will aim to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. And in doing so, it joined the European Union and about 120 other countries that have adopted similar mid-century climate pledges. And in order to, what is climate neutrality, you may ask? As a practical matter, that means that China will have to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by up to 90%. And offset the rest through natural systems or technologies that absorb more CO2 from the air than they emit. So why is this important? Well, of course, it's extremely important because China is the world's leading emitter of greenhouse gases. It's responsible for about 28% of global CO2 emissions, which is more than the United States and the EU combined. And if China is successful in achieving carbon neutrality, that will shave about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius off global warming projections, which is very important. And it would make Xi Jinping's commitment the largest climate commitment to date. But how feasible is it? Economically, technologically, politically? One thing is clear, achieving carbon neutrality is going to be a colossal undertaking for a country that is still so heavily dependent on fossil fuels. China burns half the world's coal, and it continues to build new coal-fired power plants, even though they are increasingly uneconomic and unnecessary. China also burns massive amounts of coal directly in factories that produce half of the world's steel and cement. China's the largest global auto market. It's also the world's largest importer of crude oil. And China's the largest financier of coal-fired power plants overseas as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, which is not part of the climate neutral pledge. So achieving carbon neutrality in China will require enormous and unprecedented transitions in China's energy system, its transportation system, its industry, its urban infrastructure, and its land. And in order to achieve those transformations, it will require massive amounts of investment, very difficult political reforms, and strong political will. And at every step of the way, China to date has faced stiff resistance from local governments and from powerful fossil fuel interests whose cooperation is going to be most needed. Now, in order to address that, it's going to require an integrated approach that really allows all shareholders to have a voice in decision-making and also to ensure a just transition for affected fossil fuel workers and vulnerable communities. But here's the paradox. China is also the world leader in the very clean energy technologies that will help to make this pledge feasible. China is by far the largest investor and producer and consumer of renewable energy. 1 out of 3 solar panels and 1 out of 3 wind turbines in the world are in China. China is also home to half of the world's electric cars, 98% of its electric buses, and 99% of its electric two-wheelers. China also dwarfs the rest of the world in the current and planned amount of capacity to produce batteries that will power electric vehicles and store electricity on the grid. So China's clean energy drive to date and its economies of scale have brought down the cost of these clean energy technologies so dramatically that they are threatening their fossil fuel competitors everywhere. In fact, just last week, the International Energy Agency issued its annual World Energy Outlook. And they found that solar energy is the new king of global electricity. And in fact, it is now the cheapest source of electricity in history. So, but to achieve carbon neutrality, China is going to have to accelerate everything that it's done so far. It's going to have to increase its wind, its solar, and its energy storage capacity by at least 10-fold. And it's already by far the largest in the world. But that's not enough because many new clean energy technologies need to be developed and brought down in price, especially for heavy industry. Therefore, China also has to expend enormous efforts in developing these next generation clean energy technologies like green hydrogen and carbon capture technologies. And it's already in a race with the European Union on many of these, and hopefully before too long with the US as well. Some people estimate that achieving carbon neutrality in China will cost at least $15 trillion, but it will transform the global climate fight by helping to make these next generation energy technologies available and affordable for everybody in the world. So how credible is China's carbon neutrality pledge? The timing was clearly designed to take advantage of the lack of US climate leadership at the national and international level, and possibly to preempt pressure to act on climate from a new US administration and or the European Union. But China has a track record of promising and overperforming on its climate pledges. The fact that this pledge was made by President Xi Jinping himself sends a strong signal to everybody in China that climate is a top priority, and to the rest of the world. But the devil is in the details, as Sam said. China is reportedly going to issue a mid-century climate plan to the UN within the next few months. And more importantly, it is now developing its next 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan, which will be revealed next March. And that will give us a good indication of China's intentions. But we already have some idea of where China may go with this pledge. Just last week, a group of China's top climate scientists from 18 different research organizations unveiled a proposed plan for reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. And among the key features are recommendations that China immediately put strict controls on new coal-fired power plants, peak its coal use by the end of the 5-year plan, 2025, and set a hard cap on its CO2 emissions, and also set CO2 peaking targets for key cities and key industries. However, they expect that CO2 emissions will continue to rise in the next 5 years, in large part because of natural gas consumption continuing to increase. And so you can see from the pictures here that it will continue to rise until sometime before 2030. After that, it's going to be a much steeper decline, which will be harder and more expensive. Interestingly enough, these top climate researchers also interpret China's carbon neutrality pledge to include all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. And therefore, they call for reaching net zero emissions of CO2 by 2050, and then in the next 10 years by 2060, working towards entire net zero for all greenhouse gas emissions, which would be more in line with the Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But that we will have to wait and see if that's actually how the government sees it as well. So in closing, you may be asking yourself, will China save the planet? Or will it at least do its part? And I hope you've gathered from what I've said today that the jury is still very much out. But two things are clear to me. One is that moving to a path of deep decarbonization is very much in China's own self-interest to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, to benefit from the clean energy economy, and to protect the health of its people. The second thing that's clear to me is that cooperation on climate between the world's two largest emitters will benefit both countries and accelerate the whole process for everyone. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Dean Meyer to talk about these climate issues from the US perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for such a very concise and also insightful presentation on if China could accomplish what they have pledged. China is rising to be a superpower to compete with the US as an incumbent superpower. From what Xi Jinping's pledge, we can see China has tried to lead by example although we don't know if China could accomplish that objective. But U.S. as an incumbent superpower has been withdrawing its responsibility under the Trump administration. And so many countries, as Barbara mentioned, that she mentioned more than 100 countries, but I read about 60 countries, most are small countries, have pledged for the carbon neutrality by 2050, which I think from Barbara's presentation that the Time magazine said the Earth could survive if we don't reverse the trend, will come to the catastrophe. So how U.S. as an incumbent superpower been doing on this subject? What you think, Dean and Meyer think U.S. should do in this front?
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you all for being with us today. Thank the organizers for including me. A very interesting and important topic. So we've not been doing very well, Sam. Short answer, and I'm told there's an election in 2 weeks, and much depends on that. I mean, and so obviously, if President Trump were to be reelected, that's one world, and we know what that world looks like. The U.S. will, by and large, at best be on the sidelines, and maybe even worse than that. That doesn't mean there's nothing happening. There are things happening at the state level, the cities, and in the private sector. I know Beth will talk about that. But in terms of U.S.-China cooperation, it will be more of the same, I'm afraid, and the U.S. Can't be counted or could not be counted on to lead. So the question ultimately is, if Biden wins, how different will things actually be? And I'm struck listening to Barbara's description of China. Every time one thinks about China, the capacity of the government to actually do things. There are things we don't like about that government, to be sure, but its capacity to do things is significantly different from our own capacity, notwithstanding whatever intentions President Biden would have. Like Barbara, I'm going to talk a bit about the U.S. context first before coming to the question of U.S.-China cooperation, because really, if we can't get our act together at home, our credibility in the international arena and our ability to lead is going to be, much diminished. So much depends on the outcome of the election, Biden and the Senate, in terms of what will happen in the United States. The first obvious point is that President Biden would set a completely different tone in the U.S. context. I think he's pledged to make the U.S. carbon neutral by 2050. Whether the U.S. can get there is another question. But clearly, he, to a much greater extent, actually, than in recent elections, is making climate change a signature element of the platform. I think that it will be elevated in terms of public discourse. And there are just so many ways in which leadership matters in terms of setting national goals, calling attention to the issue, restocking the EPA with qualified people, et cetera, engaging with the private sector. So I think the intention will be there to resume what it was we were doing 4 years ago and more, really. So in some ways, the question is really one of the politics of this. And there's reason to be optimistic, and there are challenges facing the United States if it seeks to, as I think Biden will want to, play a much more constructive role in the international arena and especially in cooperating with China. So one context is public opinion, and so there has been growing support in the United States for action on climate change. And the good news is I'm looking at a recent Pew poll, Pew Research Center poll that shows that 65% of Americans think that the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. So that's an increase, and there has been a pronounced increase in support and belief in climate change over the last few years. This is in a context, in some ways, it takes us back maybe to 2006 when there was higher support for this. But it is a moment where there is considerable support for certain things. What's interesting is that the support is much more in the arena, and I'll come back to this, of supporting renewable energy, planting trees, fuel efficiency for cars. It sort of walks down until you get to the tough nut, which would be something like a carbon tax. But there is support. That said, it is highly partisan and has been highly partisan. And in fact, the partisan divide shows no sign of diminishing. The percentage of Democrats who, I'm just looking at, who just said that human activity is contributing a great deal to climate change is 72% versus 22% for Republicans. And that matters in our system in profound ways. I mean, in a lot of ways, what happened as we marched up to the cap and trade bill in 2009 was a very rapid erosion of support in the Republican Party of those of the public who identified as Republican. And you could see, coincident with the rise of the Tea Party, you could see this sort of decline happening. I remember talking to friends of mine in the environment groups that were very optimistic that we were going to get a cap and trade bill. You could see that happening. And what it meant was that the Republicans, particularly Republican senators in that case, were frozen. They couldn't move on it because it was so unpopular within their party. So this remains a huge issue, I think, for our system in terms of what we can do, certainly what we can do legislatively. There are certain things I think will get bipartisan support, and I think there are a variety of subsidies for renewables and various forms of green energy investment were popular across the aisle. We can plant a lot of trees. Everyone likes that idea. You get to something like a carbon tax or a tax on corporations or even a broader carbon tax. There's a huge divide here, and now this gets into the arcane, which is whether the filibuster remains in the Senate and whether you need 60 votes or not. I worked in the Senate years ago for Bill Bradley and sort of lived that world, and so pretty attuned to that. But the peculiarity of our system as it stands now is you need a supermajority in the Senate to do anything significant, and there's serious talk about doing away with that. But in the absence of that, there's going to be some things are going to be doable, and other things are just not going to be doable. And we'll see. Obviously, depends on whether Democrats take the Senate, which I think there's a more than 50% chance of that happening, but far from certain. If that happens, if there were to be an elimination of the filibuster, then I think you could see some real movement in this space. But if not, the partisanship will still constrain what the U.S. can do in this area. Obviously, a Biden administration will try to max out regulatory actions under existing law and reverse some of the mischief that's been going on, pushing the parameters of what EPA can do with existing tools, cutting back on opening of public lands, pushing on regulation of utilities. I think there's an interesting side note here, which has to do with the court system and what is happening with the Supreme Court, which is likely to be a pretty hostile place for a regulatory action down the road. We could talk about that if anyone wants to talk about. So on the U.S. side, I see a real change in the offing in terms of the desire to engage in the world again, the desire to pick up the pieces after 4 disastrous years from an environmental standpoint, but still possibly some significant constraints. We will rejoin Paris Accords. Will we be welcome back? I think so, but much depends on whether we can walk the talk and not just talk there. But I think for the most part, much will be forgiven. There is a question then of sort of what leadership role the U.S. can resume in the international stage, and this goes to the whole question of what role China wishes to play, and the extent to which it is a trusted partner in the world. I think at this moment, the U.S. has a significant trust problem that has to be rebuilt in the international arena. But I do see us. I mean, we're certainly going to rejoin Paris and attempt to sort of pick up where we were before and go beyond. I think there'll be a lot of ambition in that space in the Biden administration. With respect to the U.S.-China relationship on this issue, there's a lot of damage been done, and we're not going back to the status quo ante for many reasons, not least of which is that China is moving fast. I mean, the China of today isn't the China of 4 years ago, let alone 8 years ago, and so it's at a different point. U.S.-China relations are certainly tenuous at best at the moment, and there's still going to be flashpoints in our relationship on human rights or security in the South China Sea and other issues, trade. So that will remain a challenge to begin to rebuild in general relations with China. But one of the things that people don't talk that much about, but very important cooperation was taking place at a kind of staff level between people in the ministries in China and in the U.S. I'm not that close to that at the moment, but I suspect that's pretty broken right now. And those kind of relationships where colleagues of mine who were in the Air Office at EPA in North Carolina when I was still at Duke, we were in China all the time and working very closely with their counterparts. That relationship would take time to rebuild and will never be quite the same just because the dynamics of change. And of course, in the green energy arena, we're going to be competitors, assuming that we seek to invest. So, our interests are not that, perhaps not fully aligned in that space. But that said, and this is the point Barbara was making at the end, I expect to see much greater cooperation. And why? Because there's no other way. I mean, we have to do this. This is, I mean, it is in the interest of China. It is in the interest of the U.S. and obviously the EU is the other big partner here, and others. India moving quickly. I mean, we just have to do this. And so I think the logic of the situation, the likely change in the administration in the United States, the slow shift in public opinion in the United States, the salience of this issue make the moment ripe for a significantly greater cooperation. And China's pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. Biden says 2050. Maybe we'll have a race to the top before this is all over. So I'll end on that optimistic note.
Thank you for the optimistic note. Yes, U.S. and China should share a lot of interests in working together to deal with the global issue, which is so-called global public goods. But on the other hand, Dean Meyer also mentioned that on the green energy, the climate smart sectors, these two countries could also be competitors. In fact, the World Bank estimates that the so-called climate smart investment opportunities in next years also will be $23 trillion and for decarbonization of the world. So from business perspective, Beth, Professor Keck, how do you think these new energy or climate smart energy sector would be like? How do you see these two countries, US and China, could be competitors or collaborators on this emerging industry?
So thank you so much, Sam, for this opportunity, and Governor Holden for your organization and what you're doing here. So what I'd like to do is actually give a little bit of perspective about the business-to-business relationships in China, and give a little, and then maybe we can come back to that specific clean tech question. As Barbara has pointed out, China and US, we are the two largest economies in the world. We are also the two largest global emitters of greenhouse gases, so we have a lot in common here. And one thing else that I think is salient to point out is that despite all the economic and political tensions of the last 4 years in particular, our economies are still very much linked. And the trade in goods between the two countries was like 500 billion last year. China is still a very important source of goods that are imported into our country, more than 400 billion, largest source of imports into our country. And so for all of those goods that go between our two countries, we have embedded in them carbon and environmental degradation. And so we have a very much a linkage in terms of, the future of our planet, the health of our planet. So as I look at this, I think about, how can firms work together? And I think there's a couple of interesting things to look at as we think about collaboration rather than competition. And one is just understanding how each of the business communities in our two countries respond to government policy. I think it's helpful to look at those business-to-business dynamics that make up that trade balance. And then, perhaps we can, from that, look at some ways that we could move forward in the future. So I'd like to start with the Chinese government, the Chinese and US companies' approaches to dealing with federal or top-level policy. And in China, I have always been struck about how Chinese companies follow the Chinese government. They always look to the government for guidance, and once they know what the way they want to go, the companies, often, will just fall right behind and support those goals and policy objectives. And one of the most interesting, I think, concrete examples of that in recent times has been poverty alleviation. As many of you know, China has an incredible record with reducing poverty in China over the last 30, 40 years. But 5 years ago, there were still 70 million people in China below the Chinese poverty line. And so President Xi Jinping put out a major goal to eliminate poverty by this year, 2020. Well, you look at what happened inside companies as a result of that major goal, and then the call for everybody to get behind that. Within 2 years, by 2017, if you looked at the CSR, the corporate social responsibility reports of the Chinese companies, you would find that poverty alleviation had become a key CSR activity for those companies. In fact, there's this wonderful consulting group in China called Sintao, and they did an analysis. And they looked at 850 CSR reports, identified 4,300 industry-driven poverty alleviation programs with an investment of renminbi $20 billion. And that was just in 2017. And so I am very optimistic about Chinese firms and Chinese industry getting behind this very big statement of policy of carbon neutrality put out by China's president last month. And I think in about another year, when we start looking at those CSR reports again, we're going to see carbon neutrality as the new, the key activity. Of course, there's going to be a lot behind that in terms of transparency and measurement, but it will be, I think, very exciting to see companies endorsing that and taking action in China. Now, I'd like to contrast that to what's happened in our country in the last 4 years. And I think it's very helpful to think about these dynamics if you're going to create cooperation. So 4 years ago, we had a complete change in terms of how our country was going to engage in the Paris Agreement, with the Trump administration announcing our withdrawal. But what happened in the business sector? Very different. Didn't follow US government policy at all. Many of our leading firms said, we do not agree. And all of a sudden, we had this new organization called We Are Still In. You can find that website, where all of these companies who have been investing in environmental and social sustainability for over a decade and for many years said, we are going to continue our work towards carbon neutrality. And for example, today, the We Are Still In group, there are nearly 4,000 businesses, universities, organizations representing $9 trillion of the US GDP who are staying behind their commitments. Well, the US GDP last year was 21 trillion. So nearly half of the GDP of our country has said, we want to continue moving forward with our environmental sustainability and carbon commitments, and including the University of Denver, who is one of our co-sponsors today. So happy to see that. And I'd be very happy to go into why this is, what are the dynamics. But I think that because of the business response, it sets us up for a very interesting, great opportunity for business-to-business collaboration. But I think something has to change for that to really be effective. And I'll take the export sector as where I think the core of the change and attitudes need to take place. So what happened in China, right? 30, 40 years ago, they needed to jumpstart their economy. They chose an export strategy for doing that, which has been incredibly successful. We see the success of that today. What the implications for that were from the United States point of view is that the competitive advantage that China had for manufacturing meant that a lot of our manufacturing went overseas. And instead of a brand like a Nike owning the factory in the United States and manufacturing those shoes here, they decided, oh, we'll just outsource that. We'll just have a contractual relationship with a factory in China or other places that can make the shoe the same at my specifications. And so we have this very interesting dynamic that happens as a result of that. In this country, we have many retailers and many, we call them now brands, brands who don't do their own manufacturing, who depend upon buying those products that are produced by those manufacturers in China. And it started out just sending over my specs for the shirt I wanted or the shoes I wanted and the quality requirements. And that was, it was very much a commercial relationship. But things happen. We've had a lot more transparency in society. And by the 1990s, what was going on was that we would have NGOs looking at what was going on in those factories and finding that the working conditions were not up to the standard that they should be, and rightfully bringing that to the attention of us as consumers and to the companies to take action. And so that has led to a very interesting dynamic, of B2B dynamic, because the environmental regulation was very poor in China. They had great regulations on the books, but the implementation of them was really poor. And so as a result, companies started their own standards for suppliers. So if you wanted my purchase order, you had to meet my standards for worker safety. Well, in the last 10 years, that has evolved to those standards for suppliers going beyond just what's happening in the workplace with the worker and with the, how the chemicals are being handled, the glasses that they are wearing, to now also encompass environmental sustainability and efficiency in those factories. And in fact, with the NDRC, I remember when I was at Walmart, we had a great collaboration on trying to bring energy efficiency into the factories because it was a great business case and it was great for the environment. And so all of a sudden, these retailers and brands were using the power of the purchase order to expand their expectations. And then with all of us recognizing that, we can't mess around with CO2 anymore, you're now seeing the push back into China's suppliers on the actual areas of CO2 reduction or GHG reduction. And so what is this? This dynamic is a very interesting power dynamic. And I would say it is a very unbalanced power dynamic because if you look at it in its core formation, it is essentially as say a retailer saying, I'll buy from you if you meet all of these standards, and then using the power of the purchase order for that leverage. What if we reset the business to business engagement and taking this particular sector, because now these Chinese firms are much more robust, and we address this power imbalance in order to actually accelerate voluntary compliance and voluntary beyond compliance activity in the business sectors and the manufacturing sector. To me, I think that's a fabulous opportunity for our two economies, our two countries, where we stand. And I think that some of the things that would have to happen for that to take place is, number one, we would have to look at who is sitting at the table. When I look at all the round tables and things that I was involved in helping to start, who was there? The retailer, the brands, and the Western NGOs. And often the manufacturers in the developing countries were not at that table initially, and they're still not terribly robust, except maybe in a few exceptions. So number one, we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion in our country because of all of the social justice activities going on. We need to think about diversity, equity, inclusion at the tables as we're developing these voluntary standards. Because I think there's always a fundamental human reaction is that if you're included, you have a stake in it and you have an emotional stake and you'll want to make things happen rather than it coming down as a hierarchical power relationship. So I think that is a change in thinking and should be explored from the U.S. business community. The other side, and the NGO community. The other side of this would be what needs to happen on the China side, and that means that the Chinese companies need to step up. I've been in forums where Chinese companies have shown up. They'll send a low-level person just to check it out. The person has no authority. And so Chinese companies, just like U.S. companies who have invested in their sustainability teams, that have really, created the momentum inside their organizations, Chinese companies need to make those very same structural investments in their companies and in their external engagement so that they can come to the table with credibility and then bring and make a difference in this voluntary standard setting that's going on, and then, together create that momentum. So that is my recommendation of how our two business communities could work together in a more effective, dynamic manner. Thank you.
Thank you for the perspectives from the business cooperative world. I see the collaborations of climate change on climate change by the two countries at three levels. One is what we have talked, especially best talked mostly about at the non-governmental level, corporations, NGOs, civil societies like our universities, these kind of organizations. The second level is the governmental level, bilateral governmental level. The third level, I think, is at the international level, at the multilateral international organizations. That's the level I think we have not talked about so far. also at the governmental level, which I think at this time is very difficult. We have to wait until election. So at the multilateral level, at the global level, that's the only question I will ask everyone. My friend from China, Dr. Huyao Wang, he is the founder and the president of the leading non-governmental think tank, Center for Global and Globalization, for China Globalization. He made a proposal last week at, I think in Switzerland, there's a high-level dialogue that China, the EU, and the US should develop a trilateral mechanism to support the green collaboration. These two big powers could play a very leading role at the multilateral level. So how each of you would think about the US-China collaboration in the future or now at these three levels, particularly at multilateral level? Maybe we'll start again from Barbara.
Thank you, Sam. That was very intriguing. And Beth, about your experience with the company-to-company collaboration. On the multilateral side, of course, we had very intense bilateral collaboration between the US and China under the Obama administration. The Climate Change Working Group had about 12 or 13 specific topic areas in which companies, NGOs, states, utilities, and so forth, from both country researchers collaborated together. But because the US has fallen so far behind, I think it's a really good idea under new US administration to make that multilateral, to make that trilateral. And yes, there's going to be competition. I mentioned that earlier. For example, Germany was the leader in solar panels. And it was actually the initial market for China's panels. And now China's way left every other country behind. Germany's not going to let that happen with, say, for example, green hydrogen, hydrogen made from renewable energy, or offshore wind. And Germany and the EU are pouring massive amounts of money into it. That's a real competition. But aside from the technologies themselves, there's tremendous opportunity for experts in the three countries to work together on shared challenges, such as how do you make your grids more flexible so they can integrate all the renewable energy that's becoming cheaper and more available. How do you make the transition from diesel cars, diesel trucks, and gasoline cars to electric? Now, we've got a situation now where California's declared that by 2035, there's going to be no more sales of gasoline or diesel vehicles. And Hainan province in China has said the same thing. But here's a situation where if the governments at the highest level of EU and of the US and China, which China is considering such a ban on polluting vehicles, if they did it together, just think about what signal that would send to the vehicle manufacturing community, to the bus manufacturers throughout the world. And I'm looking at Detroit right here. They will be able to make the necessary investments and training so they can make that switch, knowing that there'll be a market out there. I'm not saying that you come up with one standard for everybody, but if the three jurisdictions were to come up with related domestic commitments like this, it would totally transform the transportation industry. So I agree, this is the time, I think, to find areas of collaboration, even though there is going to be lots of competition.
Now let's turn to Dean Meyer, then Beth. Yeah.
Well, I certainly agree with what Barbara was saying. I mean, in the idea of China, the EU, and the US taking the lead makes a ton of sense. I think, though, when you start talking about multilateral governance, though, the question is, what's the architecture here? How do we actually structure this in a way? So what's fascinating in listening to Beth and, the rich set of connections at the business level, business to business, through supply chains, through the global value chains, NGOs who are interacting with each other. Barbara just made reference to the extensive working groups at the subnational level within governments, and then at the highest level of government. So there's a whole question in my mind so what does that actually look like? Like, how do you structure that kind of engagement of kind of multimodal governance, as it were? So you have, yes, at the highest level, the ministries of these entities, but figuring out how you are also working with the private sector, with the civil society sectors. And then the other point I would make is yes, it's great, the three big blocks in the world, but what about the rest of the world? How do you build the architecture that is really inclusive of the India, Brazil, the myriad other countries out there, many of whom are rapidly increasing their greenhouse gas production as well. And so, this is a challenge of the global multilateral architecture. In the beginning, the WTO was organized and controlled by a relatively small number of players. As it expanded its membership, including China, became much more unwieldy over time as a effective body. So I think the impulse makes total sense, but how to actually design the architecture of engagement is more complicated. And of course, at the end of the day, we have to accept a certain amount of untidiness. I mean, there's going to be, engagements on multiple fronts. But the basic idea of the three biggest emitters and most powerful blocks in the world working together, that's a great idea.
In fact, the proposal has tried to reform the UN and the UN special organizations, such as when Dean Meyer mentioned the WTO and the World Bank, IMF, to make them pay more attention to the green energy and climate change issues, which will involve all the small countries in the world. So that's kind of global multilateral institutional reform to help the climate change issue, to avoid a crisis in the future. I think that's the point. I think our team met a very good point involving all the countries in the world. Now, Beth.
So I just want to build off what both of you have said, is that, Barbara, you mentioned standards. And for all of these technical areas that you have to get into, your grid, the diesel to electric transition, it involves standards. And business hates having different standards around the world. It's very cost inefficient because of these global supply chains that have evolved. And I want to be able to sell the computer I make here in Europe. And so I need to make sure I meet the European standards. I want to sell it in China, et cetera. And so when I think about, the global cooperation, and we've had these structures very successfully before in sectors as well, is that the standard setting is a key part of that structure. And if you're thinking from your own country's competitive advantage, you do want to have influence on those standards, because standards have an impact on your global competitiveness of your business. So there's going to be competition there, but it also is a great area for pre-competitive competition, to make sure all these systems can, work interchangeably and we have the most efficient use of our global resources.
Okay, I think we open our floor to the audience. So we have received about 30 questions before our event. But we also have a lot of questions raised today. So maybe I will just go with those new questions first, see how far we can go, because we don't have much time left. Let me read one question from Bing Wei to both Barbara and Fritz. I think also Beth could jump in. Could we, the US, develop a foreign policy around climate change with China with a focus on foreign recovery? By doing so, we will restore US-China relationship and gain bipartisan agreement. How do you think? If the new administration would focus on the climate change with China?
Yes.
Hey, Barbara.
I think that it's a very, very important area to focus on, in particular because the climate or carbon neutral target, as I mentioned, will require renewed efforts, accelerating efforts to develop carbon sinks, forests in particular, that can take the carbon out of the air and absorb it. And it's funny, but China, for as long as I've been working there, has been the leader in planting trees. However, it is fallen way behind in managing those forests so that they can continue to survive and thrive. And so this is an area where community work, even at the local level, individual level, on how do you manage forests, how do you manage them sustainably, could be of great help for China in meeting its carbon neutral target. And of course, what about forest management with all the wildfires that are going on? There's a lot of debate on the best way to do that, but it's come to the fore. And so, yes, I think the U.S. Heartland China Association has probably a lot of members with a lot of knowledge that can come to bear on this issue in a way that's really going to help China and vice versa.
So here.
Yeah. No, I love the question. And if you scan across the set of issues that are on the table with U.S. and China, many of them we're competitors. Many of them are points of tension on the security issues, on human rights, even on some of the economic issues. This though is a public good. This is a global public good. This is an area where we actually have common interests. And so if I was thinking about how do I reset the relationship between the U.S. and China, and I'm looking for an issue where we can make progress and change the tenor of things, there's a lot to be said for really making this a centerpiece of U.S.-China relations. It will be hard to address a lot of these other issues, and they're going to continue to be flashpoints. But this is an area where we by and large, we share interests. We're both better off if we collaborate. And I think there'll be a will to do that. So I think it's a very interesting question. Climate has never been a centerpiece of foreign policy. I mean, it's just, it's those of us who've worked in it at all have always been frustrated at how marginalized it tends to be. But here's a moment where, because it's such a salient issue, or so much more salient of an issue globally, and because I suspect both countries are going to be looking for ways to lower the temperature in our relationship, I could see this as being an important element of the evolving U.S.-China relationship.
Beth, you want to say? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to share a small anecdote, if you don't mind. So I'm a real believer in having multi-dimensional relationships with countries. And right now, of course, it's really troubling because there's such a black and white view of China, that it's all bad and, and there's no good with China. And that's, puts us on a very dangerous pathway. And when I was in mid-career living in Beijing as the FAA rep, my agency had about 8 different lines of business engagement with China: air traffic control, safety, security of airports, how you regulated airplanes, on and on and on and on and on. And I was the second person to hold that job, to be the rep. And what I did is I went out and I built a relationship with every different part of that agency that my agency had expertise in. Because what I discovered is that when they crashed an airplane and things were going bad on that front, If they were going good in terms of our air traffic control relationship, it kept the relationship solid and in balance. And for me, a point of personal pride when I left that particular post and did my final calls on my counterparts, this person over here would say, oh, it was our relationship on security that was most important. This person said it was air traffic. This person said it was, the manufacture of airplanes or the operations. To me, that was success, because what it did is that if you have multi-divisional relationships, then you can manage the really tough stuff over here, and you don't get derailed into war because you've got good stuff still going on over here. And right now, we're just focusing on the tough stuff, and we're not, putting any effort into the areas where we can have cooperation across the myriad complexities of our two governmental systems. And to me, that's a high risk. I like to go back to the Secretary Paulson's system of having these big strategic dialogues once again, so that we can really hone in all the multi-dimensions of the relationship and keep things in a better balance. It's going to be much healthier from an economic point of view and from just an overall climate point of view as well.
Okay, so we have so many questions. Let me just pick up some of them I think are relevant to the discussion here. We have a colleague, Colin Hendricks. He, in fact, is the director of the new program, Sustainability, created by our Dean. And he has a question, which is very long. I don't want to read this question too long. Basically, the question here he has is that decarbonizing the energy system will draw the geopolitical attention or competition from those oil, gas, those fossil industries to the new and climate clean energy sector. In this context, how could we talk about climate change collaboration, but on the other side of the coin is that how can we avoid new geopolitical competition in the climate change industry? That's what his question is. What Cold War like? I think the question makes sense. Why? Because now on the pandemic, we think also this is public goods. This is non-security side, non-zero sum competition. But for the vaccine part, I see the competition between China and the US, which I don't think that should be. We also joined the WHO, the vaccine program, but US has not joined. China reluctant until several weeks ago to join the vaccine program of WHO. So how can we avoid this competition? So who wants to take this first?
Yeah.
Okay, Barbara.
Very good question. I tried to read the whole thing, and I know you talk about the raw materials that are used in clean energy technologies, and China is really working hard to corner the market on those things like cobalt, and how the demand for these rare earth minerals and other raw materials is going to skyrocket. How do we deal with that? Well, it's so important, as you do, to look at the whole life cycle impact of these clean energy technologies. Continuing to mine these minerals is just not sustainable in the long term. So there's two alternatives here that really need to be pursued, and one of them is recycling of these batteries. You can't continue; there just isn't enough materials to service this growing demand. It's interesting enough that China already recognizes this. It's already a leader in recycling electric vehicle batteries, not out of the goodness of its heart, but because it realizes that there's economic value in doing so. But the other alternative is really I mentioned developing the next generation technologies, developing alternatives to batteries, for example, that don't rely so much on these questionable minerals. And I understand that Tesla is already doing R&D on cobalt-free batteries. This is the kind of innovation where an R&D that the U.S. has always excelled at given adequate funding. And so I agree with many people who've called upon, if there is a new U.S. administration, for ramping up spending on R&D for clean energy technologies in order to harness that innovation, which is the U.S. competitive advantage.
Okay, who?
So,
Higher.
well, first, I appreciate the question, Cullen. You do put your finger on, this is not a global public good. There is a competitive element to that, and one has to recognize that. There are ways in which, in fact, as Barbara was just talking, I think that the competition can be healthy to the extent that we are, the countries are racing to develop these technologies and investing and competing in some sense on the subsidy side of things. But the other thought I would have in this whole space, which is how do we deal with the negative externalities? So if I were, the negative consequences of competition of one kind or another. And what that calls for is some kind of agreement on the rules of the game. And so I think there's still a space there for at the governmental level agreeing on ways in which we would try to steer away from these, the really negative consequences of these, reliance on these minerals, for example, that have such deleterious effects on labor. I still think there's a rule for that, and as part of the effort, and there perhaps we do share some interests.
Okay, Beth, you want to say? Okay, then the next question is just come in. A question from Adelaide David. Thank you for your insightful comments and a great panel. How do you think the U.S.-China could promote the green transition while simultaneously balancing equality and justice? How do you think of this question? How they can, maybe they involve some kind of human rights issues or maybe some other value issues here. That's my understanding of this question. Okay, Beth.
Barbara, do you want to start, or I can start? I don't care.
Beth, why don't you start, because you think you have interesting things to say from the CSR standpoint,
Yeah. So, this is an area that I'm just really educating myself on. And I was out in Oakland for a conference last year, sustainability conference. And this whole, really better understanding what's happened in our own country in terms of neighborhoods and the environmental pollution that has affected people of color in our own country is just, for me, something I've really started focusing on in the past year, and particularly since this summer. And it is very much something that we have to be much more cognizant around, is that our government policies, and I can only talk in my own country, I don't really understand all that's happened in China, except that I do know that there's an excellent book that's coming out called Toxic Politics, out of a Council on Foreign Relations expert, Huang Yanzhong.
Yes.
Yeah. His new book says that 80% of Chinese citizens are regularly exposed to pollution levels higher than those considered safe by the EPA. People in China are more adversely affected by environmental degradation than those in almost any other country. And that is, if you're talking 80%, that's all economic levels. And so very much, if you look at it from that perspective, it is a social justice, and it is a public health crisis for China. Now, in our country, I happen to live in a town where it's pretty nice here, got pretty blue skies. I don't live in Oakland, where highways were put, intentionally through communities of color, and zoning was set up so that the industrial activities of the ports or the oil refineries were right next to those neighborhoods, causing much higher levels of cancer and other issues. And so this is something that we need to take very seriously, and we need to, clean up our act here at home. And we need to bring this into our global conversation as well.
I think, it's interesting, Barbara, you were talking, Beth, earlier you were talking about the sort of the positive side of CSR and the extent to which almost every corporation has a CSR plan, and we've seen a lot of progress in that space. But the other side of this is the increased concentration of power, economic power, in the hands of very large companies. So the good side is they can use that power for good, but at the same time, there's also a fascinating question about the relationship between that and, say, growing economic inequality, particularly within country inequality. And so I think this is a fascinating terrain. I don't know the answer to the question, but I suspect we have to be careful about relying ultimately solely, and not that you're arguing for that, but relying solely on private governance as a mechanism for addressing these kinds of concerns. So somehow there's got to be an intersection between the civil society that's putting pressure on those systems, governments that are putting pressure on those systems, to recognizing that, of course, this is the way that the economy is structuring. And so finding ways to leverage their economic power to accomplish whether it's environmental issue ends or social justice ends. And so I don't know that that's an answer to the question, but I just think it's kind of next frontier issue for us.
Yeah. Barbara, do you want to say something? I want to add on to this, but I don't want to.
I agree with you, Beth, about the issue of pollution exposure being a social justice issue. Many of the people with the highest levels of exposure in China are workers at these factories. And so I wanted to highlight another related social issue that I alluded to before, which is how do you ensure, as you go through this transition away from fossil fuels, that you can have just transition, livelihood for the workers in these factories. This is an issue for the United States as well, for the Midwest in particular, and it's going to become more and more important. And I was delighted to learn that there are some really wonderful examples in the Midwest of cities and governments, state governments, who are working to help with that transition, training of workers from fossil fuel industry for new jobs. And in one of them, I think it's Nebraska, they're actually focusing on people of color and targeting those trainings for the most vulnerable communities. And I do believe this is a very fruitful and important area where both countries have a lot to learn and a lot of progress to make and can learn from each other.
Great. Sam, do we have a chance for me to add on to what Dean Mayer
try
said?
To be brief, then we.
Well, sorry. So I'm really struck, by what you brought up about the concentration of wealth in these large corporations and their foundations. And I have to tell you, I'm completely changing how I'm teaching this year, because the classic approach to corporate social responsibility was, you have your company's interests here and you have your social issues here, and then what's that little intersection, and then that's where you take action. And the fallacy of that, of course, is that you're only acting with your money in your own interest, and you're not thinking about these broader concerns that are part of the structural inequities. And essentially, it's perpetuating issues without getting to the bottom line. And so I just think that this is a really important area for action and thought. And Barbara, agree with both of you guys.
So we don't have much time left. Let me read two more questions. In fact, one is already mentioned about CSR, so corporate social responsibility issue, and the labor issue Barbara mentioned, because this issue, for me, I think personally, is a very serious issue in China, especially. So the question is, given the issues in existing renewable energy supply chains, what implications could national labor rights have in proposed movements toward renewable energy? Does progressive environment policy need to be paired with increased worker protection? Especially, I think that's China. U.S. maybe also the question. Another I think another question for me interesting. I think is for Barbara and the whole panel. You spoke about international factors which have driven Xi Jinping's decision to make this commitment now. I'm curious what you and the panel consider to be the domestic political factors also driving or affecting this decision. These are from Laura and Danny. Also from Sweden College, in fact, from Tsinghua University. She is from China. Your colleague, Beth.
Wonderful.
So you want to start, Beth, to respond
Well, actually,
to your colleague?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with the second question about domestic factors. And, you know, one thing that's very clear in China is that there's a huge understanding about the environmental degradation now. I lived in China in the mid-90s, mid-90s I was there. And we would have haze out our window and everybody called it haze. But today, everybody knows it's the PM 2.5, and that is not good for you. And so there, you know, because so many people are being directly affected, I believe that, you know, the environmental situation there, the degradation, you know, is a domestic policy issue. And that's also important in terms of, you know, China's credibility on the global stage. You know, you have to have, you know, your domestic environment can't be a lot different from what you're doing globally as well, you know, to have credibility. So it plays in to, I think, their international stature as well.
Okay.
And just real quickly, I agree completely. Pollution is important, and air pollution in particular has really driven so much of Chinese action on climate change, because coal is the major factor causing the air pollution as well as the carbon emissions. And there's one more domestic reason, of course, is that China understands that clean energy is the largest market opportunity of the 21st century. And they are determined to lead the way on this. We've got their Made in China 2025 proposal, where they have already highlighted 10 industries where they want to be world leaders, including electric vehicles, modernized shipping, high-speed rail, and ultra-high voltage transmission lines. And the list goes on and on, I mentioned before, but China recognizes that this is good for their economic bottom line, and as well as the long-term sustainability of their economic system, which is under stress lately. They have to move away from that export-driven, heavy industry-focused economic model if they're going to survive.
Dean Meyer?
Well, I can't comment too much on the Chinese
American side labor.
We'll talk about, you know, I'll try to tackle the other questions. Very interesting question. You know, I come at it, of course, in the U.S. context where, you know, it's been a challenge to build this coalition across, labor and environment. I remember I was quite involved with negotiations of the side agreements on the NAFTA years ago. And it was fascinating because these two worlds were completely different. No coalition building across to speak of across the environmental groups and the labor groups. So I think it's an interesting challenge. It may be the case, though, as we move into more of a green economy, where more of the jobs are in fact linked up with and not seen as in competition with the environment, that these coalitions start to be more plausible, and so that you could see a kind of joining of the interests in worker rights and protections with environmental concerns and other social justice concerns, whether that's in the context of pushing for governmental policy or in the context of the CSR policies of companies that we've been talking about. So very interesting question, though.
Okay, I think the time's 1:30, which is we planned time to end this panel. I think we have done a very good job, and we received a lot of comments, and quite a few at the end say how wonderful the panel is. So I want to thank you all for joining the discussion to be such a good panelists. By the way, for Beth, you mentioned Huang Yanzhong spoke. In fact, Huang Yanzhong at the Council of Foreign Relations, we are good friend, very good friend for many, many years. He spoke is so pessimistic. I don't know if you noticed that, but this panel brought me really optimistic about the future. So I will tell him he's wrong about the pessimistic view. And now, should I turn to Min-Wan?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I know Barbara and Beth and Fritz and you all have busy schedule, but you can tell from the question we have, we may have to do a follow part 2 on this. But thank you for your time. We're really glad we have this great discussion. So have a wonderful rest of your day. And the replay link will be made available. And Barbara and Beth and then Dean and Sam, if you want the questions people submitted, I can send to you later. We can plan for a follow-up.
Okay, thank you again. And also Governor Holden.
Yeah.
Thank our Dean, thank Beth, thank Barbara.
Thank you
Nice
all.
to
I
see you.
really
Thank
enjoyed it.
you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.